Welcome back. I'm Dr. Cheek and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And today we have another installment of We Need to Talk. And what do we need to talk about today? Well, we need to talk about the use of psychology speak or psychobabble or psychology language. Now, for those who are new to the channel, this series is me giving my educated advice on different psychology aspects. Again, I say this in every video or most videos. Take this advice with the same veracity you take any advice from anyone who's not met you personally. So I say that to say it's advice. It's based on my psychological understanding, my experience, and my education. Take it or leave it. It's your choice. But today we're going to talk about the use of psychology speak or psychology language in therapy sessions. And this came up for me because I recently binged watched couples therapy. And in couples therapy, I noticed that there was a trend of a lot of people using a lot of psychology language and a lot of terms, sometimes appropriately, sometimes misinterpreted or misutilized, and sometimes effectively utilized. So I wanted to talk about this because it's starting to come up more in my own therapy sessions, and I have an opinion about it. So let me say this first. I agree with Dr. Orna. She pointed it out in one of the episodes that the use of psychology language has become more prevalent. And I agree with her that I appreciate it. It's helpful, it's warranted. I like the fact that people are finding the language to express themselves. I like that people are trying to understand themselves more fully as it relates to mental health. I think the more we understand about mental health, the greater the likelihood of us removing some of the stigma around mental health. And I like that people are trying to understand their experiences as it relates to maybe having a mental health condition or understanding the human experience psychologically and having the words to kind of describe their experiences and what they are feeling and how they are feeling in those moments. However, the use of psychology speak can become problematic when we use it as a way to either distance ourselves from the experience itself and try to speak to an experience that we're not really clear on how to put in layman's terms or common sense terms. So we use these words that's supposed to have an inherent meaning to stand in for what we can actually articulate. But it's also problematic when we use the language to maybe discredit someone else's experience of us or to limit our accountability in certain situations. We use this language to say, this is the psychology theory behind my behavior. And it can sometimes take the accountability away from problematic behaviors that we are actually displaying. So I say all that to say, I have run into at least two different types of individuals when it comes to therapy sessions that use psychology speak. That very first one is the most helpful. It's the person who fully understands the psychology language, who utilizes the language to describe how their experience is, what they are experiencing mentally, emotionally, physiologically as it relates to these everyday experiences. We are living in a world where we use our brains and our hearts and our emotions on a daily basis. So if you find the language to explain that in a way that it makes sense to you and to others, awesome. And that person who uses the psychology language appropriately makes statements that go in line with what they are experiencing. They are also the types of individuals that when you ask them to explain what is meant by the terminology that they're using, two things happen. One, they're able to explain it in everyday behaviors that they engage in or everyday behaviors that they find problematic that someone else is engaging in. They use the terms in ways that are accurate in its description, its appropriateness, and its definition. They tend to have a full understanding of the psychology language and they use it in an accurate way. And when you're asked, because I am the therapist that I don't mind people using psychology speak, but I don't allow psychology speak to stand in for real actions. So if you're telling me you're shutting down or you're closed off or you're dissociating, my next follow-up question is, well, what does that look like for you? Because we can use the terms all day and we use the terms as if it has an inherent meaning. And for most people, it has an inherent meaning. But if you can't define the behaviors or the experiences that you're having to align with those terms, are we using them effectively? And that goes into the second individual that I tend to see in therapy. That is the individual that tends to use the psychology language as a way to intellectualize their experience, but also to distance themselves from any behavioral experiences that they're having. So they tend to use the language in a way that is sometimes inappropriate, that it sometimes misrepresents the actual term, is not truly aligned with the definition or the description or the psychological theory behind the use of that term. They tend to use the psychology language as a stand-in for being able to describe what their experiences are. They tend to sometimes actually create their own definitions for psychology terms that truly has an actual definition to define what the behaviors look like, what the experiences look like, and how they might show up in your lives. That second individual tends to use these terms in their own self-created way. And when you try to explain it, or when you try to ask them to explain it, they may become defensive. They are unable to find the words to explain what they're experiencing. They're not are able to describe their behaviors or another person's behavior that goes in line with what they are describing in this psychological term. But in this space that we're in right now, where people have the ability or likelihood of creating their own realities, it's helpful for us to be clear that when we use psychology language, if you're not able to define, if you're not able to put that in terms of where it actually applies to your life, you're just using the label as a definitive statement and not as a precursor for your description of what that looks like in your life, then it's less helpful. So, as a psychologist, when people come into my office with psychology speak or where they want to use a lot of psychological language, I get it and it makes sense. And I appreciate it and I applaud it. If that's what you want to do, if that's how you want to kind of present what your experiences are, I am 100% cool with it. But be prepared to answer the question of what does that look like in your life? How do you define that? And I will frequently say, I know what the clinical definition of this is, or I know what the theory behind this language or this word is, but tell me, what does that look like for you? Tell me, what does that mean to you? And I do this because I don't want to get into this place where we create psychology terms that are as a catch-all without actually being clear about what those psychology terms are. And that happens frequently. I have had to, on several occasions, correct people for using the inappropriate term for a certain experience. And I'm not doing it in a derogatory way. I'm not doing it in a way that's meant to be demeaning. I'm doing it in a way that I want you to be able to speak to your experience. But I want you to correctly be able to speak to your experience. And I don't want us to get to a place where we weaponize psychology language and we're not able to describe it in a way that I'm able to tell you what my experience is, even if I take this word out. And that's what I'm looking for as your therapist and a psychologist. I'm looking for you to be able to verbalize or explain to me the situations, your behaviors, another person's behaviors, even if this word for it didn't exist. Because that lets me know that you understand your experience, and that helps me understand your experience and give you therapeutic treatment or therapeutic analysis and understanding from a perspective of I know your situation, not I am assuming what your situation is simply because you've used this psychological term. Now, we needed to talk about this because in this age of social media and people like myself who make videos, who describe or talk about psychological terms, and other people who describe and talk about psychological terms and not always being clear about what those things mean because they may not have the full understanding of those terms, or you take a snippet or a 30-second clip from TikTok or Instagram and you use it to apply it to your life, and the way you're applying it is in a haphazard way and it's not fully identifying how your experiences truly are. It can be problematic because it's not us really truly understanding our experiences in a way that we can get the help that we need. It's problematic because sometimes it allows us to distance ourselves from the experience and simply say, put a label on what we're experiencing without actually having to deal with what the experiences are the emotions behind that label. It's problematic because it can be used as a weaponization to keep people from maybe asking questions further or being clear about what you're experiencing, because using that term is not a catch-all, and no one can assume simply because you use a psychological term or any psychological term that you fully understand what that might look like in your life or you are using it appropriately, because we don't always use that language appropriately. And for those out there who are using psychology language in everyday life, I caution you on using that, because even in these videos, I will say a psychological way of saying something, and then I say put it in your own words, because sometimes when we use psychology language with everyday people, with our interactions with everyday people, those who we love and care about, that language can seem disconnected from the experience. It feels and it sounds too clinical sometimes to be able to have like a genuine conversation with someone. It's because when we use psychology language in everyday conversation, it may cause others to disconnect because it doesn't always feel genuine to who you are as a person, especially for someone who's known you for a really long time and now you're talking to them in very like clinical terms. And I'll admit the clinical term does not always sound inviting when you're having a conversation with loved ones. So I, as a practitioner, as a clinician, don't use it with my family, don't use it with my friends. I'll use it if I'm trying to explain a concept, but in an everyday conversation, psychological terms do not come up. And I'll ask for individuals to, as much as you can, forego using psychology terms to explain your experience and simply explain what you're thinking and what you're feeling. The term for it is not always necessary, and we don't always use the appropriate or the necessary term to explain our experiences. So this is why we needed to talk, because as much as I appreciate and applaud that individuals have the ability to find the way to express what they're thinking and feeling using psychological language, it is much more helpful and more successful to simply use your own words. And be open for clarification. Be open to understand that I might not be using the appropriate word choice, but this is my experience. So if I explain to you how I'm feeling and what this experience is, even if I don't have the appropriate term, you are clear about what I am feeling and what I'm experiencing. And as a therapist, I'll take that any day over psychological language. As always, I hope you take something from this video that was helpful, that was informative, that gave you new information that you didn't have before. Again, this is my educated opinion. This is based off my own experience. Take this opinion the same way you take opinions from people who don't know you personally. As always, feel free to jot down any thoughts, questions, or comments you have below. I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll be seeing you again very soon. Thank you.